Welcome to lecture number 27. Lecture number 26 में we started the topic of financial statement analysis with respect to the investor. और हमने degree of financial leverage we studied it in detail. Now in lecture number 27 we will look at other ratios and other concepts which can help an investor in determining what sort of profits the investor is expected to get uh, and how much benefit the investor can expect uh, from investing in any company. The second ratio is called earnings per common share. Now, what is earnings per common share? EPS is a measure of profitability that shows how much of a company's profit is assigned to each of its common shares. Earnings per share, the amount of income earned on a share of common stock during an accounting period. Now, what does it mean? It means if you are an investor and you are planning to buy, let's say, 100 shares in a company, then EPS will tell you how much profit of that company will be assigned to each common share that you hold. Uh, uh, it applies only to common stock and to corporate income statements. Non-public companies, because of cost benefit considerations, do not have to report earnings per share. Because earnings per share receives much attention from the financial community, investors and potential investors, it will be described in some. Now, fortunately, as an investor, you do not need to compute earnings per share. Why not? Because a company is required to present it at the bottom of the income statement. Per share amount for discontinued operations and extraordinary items must be presented on the face of the income statement or in the notes to the financial statement. It means that earnings per share is has a lot of significance in the market. तभी as per the laws in US जो आपकी corporations हैं they have to show it in their financial statements. Earnings per share for recurring items is the most significant for primary analysis. जो आपके recurring items है it means you जो आपके extraordinary items हैं उनको you do not include it. Because why? Because you expect कि जो आपके extraordinary items हैं since they will not occur in the next financial statement, so you always look at the recurring items when you are calculating the earnings per share. Computing earnings per share initially involves net income, preferred stock, dividend declared and accumulated, and the weighted average number of shares outstanding as follows. So the formula for earnings per share is net income minus preferred dividends divided by weighted average number of common shares outstanding. Since earnings pertain to an entire period, they should be related to the common shares outstanding during the period. Thus, the denominator of the equation is the weighted average number of common shares outstanding. Denominator में आपके you always have the weighted average number of common shares. To illustrate, assume that a corporation had 10,000 shares of common stock outstanding at the beginning of the year. तो इसने आपको दिया हुआ है shares outstanding at the beginning. On July 1 it issued 2000 shares. So July to September जो है आपके shares increased from 10,000 to 12,000 and on October 1st it issued another 3000 shares. तो आप देखेंगे जो आपके shares outstanding थे for the first 6 months it was 10,000. फिर जुलाई में you issued 2000 तो आपके 12,000 हो गए थे and अक्टूबर में you issued 3000 more तो आपके हो गए थे 15,000. So what you do, you calculate the weighted average. तो जो आपकी fraction of the year है first 6 months के आपकी average 5,000 की थी. उसके बाद आपकी July to September it was 3,000 for the 3 months. और जो आपके अक्टूबर नवंबर दिसंबर के थे इट वाज 3750। तो जो आपकी एवरेज बनी थी फॉर द होल ईयर इट वाज 11750। so that is how you calculate the weighted average when it comes to the outstanding shares. When the common shares outstanding increase as a result of a stock dividend or stock split, if you remember, ये हमने किया था when when we were studying the stocks of any company. Retroactive recognition must be given to these events for all the comparative earnings per share presentation. जो आपके स्टॉक डिविडेंड स्टॉक स्प्लिट्स हैं दे डू नॉट प्रोवाइड द फर्म विद मोर फंड्स, दे ओनली चेंज द नंबर ऑफ आउटस्टैंडिंग शेयर। फॉर एग्जांपल बहुत सी कंपनीज होती हैं वो कहती हैं कि आपका जो एक स्टॉक है फ्रॉम नाउ ऑन दैट विल बी इक्विवेलेंट टू टू स्टॉक्स। तो होता क्या है जो आपका वैल्यू होती है ऑफ ईच स्टॉक इट डज नॉट चेंज, ओनली the comparative value number of stocks increase. The current earnings per share guidelines call for the presentation of basic earnings per share and diluted earnings per share. Now, what is basic earnings per share? It is computed by dividing net income less preferred dividends by the weighted average number of shares of common stock outstanding during the period, जैसे हमने अभी देखा था। जो आपका diluted earnings per share है, it is computed by dividing net income less preferred dividends by the weighted average of number of shares of common stock outstanding plus the dilutive effect of potentially dilutive securities। तो जो आपका diluted earnings per share है इसमें आप बेसिक शेयर्स के अलावा यू कंसिडर अदर सिक्योरिटीज एज वेल, जो कि आपकी जो पोटेंशियली डाइल्यूटिव सिक्योरिटीज होती हैं वो आपकी कन्वर्टेबल सिक्योरिटीज होती हैं, वारंट्स होते हैं, ऑप्शंस होते हैं, अदर राइट्स। Exhibit 9.3 presents the earnings per share of Nike for year 7, 8, 9. There was a material increase in earnings per share for 8 and material decrease for 9. अच्छा, अब आप देखेंगे 9 में जो आपकी बेसिक अर्निंग्स पर शेयर थी वो 3.07 थी, जो आपकी 2007 में थी वो 2.963 और जो 2008 में थी तो 3.8 थी। तो आप देखेंगे कंपेयर टू 2007 8 में there was a basic earnings per share increase and in 9 it decreased with respect to 2008। अच्छा, क्वेश्चन होता है कि हाउ डू यू इंटरप्रेट द the earnings per share figure that you get। For example, हम एक कहते हैं ABC है, it is the earnings after tax of 20,000, preferred dividends 3,000 and 1,000 जो है इसके outstanding common shares हैं। So how will you calculate the earnings per share? 20,000 minus 3,000 divided by 100,000, तो वो आपको दे देगा a figure of 17 cents। Now what does this 17 cents represent? इसका मतलब ये है कि if ABC were to distribute 100% of its profit to the common shareholders, each person would receive 17 cents for each share held। So जो if you hold one share, तो हर share पे you will get 17 cents। Profit to earnings ratio, the the price to earnings ratio, the price to earnings ratio PE ratio expresses the relationship between the market price of a share of common stock and that stock's current earnings per share। तो इसमें जो आपका होता है मार्केट प्राइस पर शेयर उसको आप डिवाइड करते हैं, जो आप कैलकुलेट करते हैं अपना EPS उससे। Using diluted earnings per share results in a higher price earnings ratio, which is a conservative computation of ratio। Ideally, PE should be computed using diluted earnings per share for continuing earnings per share। This gives an indication of what is being paid for a dollar of recurring आपका जो है earnings। अच्छा ना, हाउ डू यू कैलकुलेट इट? यू नो मार्केट प्राइस पर कॉमन शेयर आपको 2008 की भी गिवन है और 2009 की भी। आपको जो अर्निंग्स पर शेयर है बिफोर नॉन रिकरिंग आइटम्स वो आपने कैलकुलेट किए हैं, जैसे आपको फॉर्मूला गिवन था अर्निंग्स पर शेयर का। उससे व्हेन यू कैलकुलेट इट so you get this way you can calculate price earnings ratio simply by dividing market price जो उस टाइम पे शेयर की है divided by the diluted earnings per share. So you get the price earnings ratio. Why is the price earnings ratio considered a gauge of future earning power? Because the investors attach a higher price to the securities that they feel have higher potential. This gives a higher price earnings ratio. Percentage of earnings retained. The proportion of current earnings retained for internal growth is computed as follows. तो the percentage of earnings retained का मतलब है कि कौन सी कंपनी जो है वो अपने प्रॉफिट का कितना हिस्सा बिजनेस में एज रिटेन्ड earnings रखती है. The percentage of retained earnings, the percentage of earnings retained is better for trend analysis if non-recurring items are removed. This indicates what is being retained of recurring earnings, determine dividends from the statement of cash flow. इसमें आप from where do you get the dividends? You get it using the cash flow statement. Many firms have a policy on the percentage of earnings that they want retained. For example, जो आपकी the average is between 60 to 75%. In general, new firms, growing firms, and firms perceived as growth firms will have a relatively high percentage of earnings retained. Many new firms, growing firms, and firms perceived as growing do not pay dividends. So जो आपकी growing firms होती हैं या नई companies होती हैं, they do not pay dividends. तो उनमें obviously जो आपकी percentage of earnings retained है, that will always be high. Exhibit 9.5 shows the percentage of earnings retained by Nike using 9 and 8 figures. Nike retains a substantial portion of its profits for internal use. आप देखते हैं let's say we look at the 2009 figures for Nike. तो उसकी आप देखेंगे जो net income before non-recurring items है that is 1486.7 million dollars. आपने उसका आपका जो dividend था आपने उसे subtract किया so you get earnings retained. ये वाली वो earnings है जो आपने अपने profit का हिस्सा retain किया है in business to keep it in circulation. तो परसेंटेज ऑफ अर्निंग्स रिटेन्ड आपकी क्या है अर्निंग्स रिटेन्ड डिवाइडेड बाय नॉन नेट इनकम बिफोर नॉन रिकरिंग आइटम. So this 68.61 represents कि for every $1 that you earn उसका उसमें से 6861 जो आपके cents हैं that you keep in the business. So this is the end of lecture number 26.